Recording now. Okay. Well, here we are. All you see is a yellow screen right now. So here I am, Jerry. You don't get to see me, but you get to see my program. And I'm glad that all you folks are here today. What we're doing is looking at what I call the Southern Humboldt Trilogy. It's 3 books about Southern Humboldt County that were published last year. It's part of this longer series I'm doing that's called The History of Humboldt County Peoples and Places. And eventually it's going to cover the whole county and should be 7 books long. But the ones we're going to look at today are the 3 for Southern Humboldt that turned out I was actually trying to just do 1 book, but it got so long that it turned into 3 books. And so we'll look at a little of those today. And I'll mention right now that these books are available online. If you go to the Cal Poly Humboldt Library website and then go to the press at Cal Poly, which is sponsored by the library, you can Google my name, for example, at that point and get a search place where you can actually download any of the 4 books that they've published for me, including these 3 that we'll look at today. So very briefly, I'm going to just take you on a tour of the books and on a tour of Southern Humboldt. And if you have questions along the way, be sure to ask them, because I like responding right at the time when something comes up on screen. Okay, so the first book is called Southern Humboldt Indians, and it covers 6 tribes from Southern Humboldt County out of the 13 named tribes that we could find within the boundaries of the entire county. And that's kind of an introduction to Humboldt County in the southern areas because, of course, the native people were here way before the whites arrived, and we tried dealing with their, not their culture so much, but with their history from the early days first to kind of set the stage for then what happened after whites arrived. So here we have a map of Southern Humboldt County, and the 6 tribes that we cover down there, these are the ones that ethnographers have identified, and sometimes the names aren't very accurate or even correct. They certainly aren't the ones that the Indians themselves called themselves, but what we know as the Bear River tribe, which, as you see on this map, in the area where Bear River drains out to the coast, and they also came over Bear River Ridge into the Rio Dell and Scotia area and all the way up to Hydesville, actually. And then south of them were the Mattole Indian tribe, so another tribe named for a river, the Mattole River down here. And they were in the lower stretches of the Mattole River around Petrolia and a few miles upriver from that. And then a tribe that had a very large area, the Sinkyone, or sometimes called Sinkyone tribe, which, as you can see, covered almost half of Southern Humboldt County, and actually goes off the map into Mendocino County a little ways also. But places like Shelter Cove and Garberville, Petrolia, all the South Fork Eel communities were part of this tribe's traditional territory, and we'll look a little bit about that later on. Then down in the extreme southeastern corner of Humboldt County, we have the Wailaki tribe, which was mostly located in northern Mendocino and western Trinity County, but a little bit of their territory came through Humboldt County along the Eel River. And up above them, it's downriver on the Eel, the Lassic tribe. Of course, most of us have heard of the Lassic Peaks or maybe gone out and seen them. They were named for Indian leader of this group whose name the name he was given was Lassic. He had an Indian name that was somewhat different, but they were people who occupied the Fort Seward area and up towards Blocksburg and over into Trinity County. Then the last tribe in Southern Humboldt, the Nongaddles, also had a very large area. They were people that occupied pretty much the entire drainage of the Van Dusen River and a little bit of the Mad River, and a little bit of Larrabee Creek. And so if you drive out Highway 36, for example, along the Van Dusen River, you would be mostly going through Noongadal territory until you got across the Trinity County line. Now, so those are the 6 tribes that ethnographers have named and identified. But then if you start looking at their field notes and getting additional information from what's published even, you find out that most of these groups were not just tribes, they were collections of smaller tribal groups. And for example, the Noongadals and the Sinkionis both had about 20 separately named groups within their territory. And if you happened to have been back 200 years ago and could talk to one of these people and ask them, well, what's the name for your people, or where do you come from? They wouldn't have said, oh, I'm a Noongadal. They would have said something like, I'm a Cattell Kia, or they would have other names like that for their particular area. They identified very closely just to a small stretch of land, usually along a river or creek. So if we added it all up, we'd have over 50 separately named groups down here in southern Humboldt County, not just the 6 tribes themselves. And that's one of the things that this book on the southern Humboldt Indians goes into. It gives the names for these tribes and describes their territory and tells a little about each of the individual groups within them. Here's 2 men that were actually interviewed in the early 1900s and also on into the 1910s and 20s. The man on the left is named George Burt. The man on the right was called Charlie, or sometimes Bryceland Charlie, from the area that he lived in. And they were interviewed in the early 1900s by one of the first ethnographers that came out to this area and systematically tried to collect information from the early day Indians. So, the whites arrived pretty much as a force in Humboldt County in 1850, and we had about 15 years of what we have to call the Indian genocide, when many of the Indians were deliberately killed by the whites in an attempt to gain control of the area and to reduce the Indians' power and to simply get them out of the way. But fortunately, some of the Indians managed to survive, and these 2 men had survived that time period. And in the case of George Burt, went to reservations. We don't know as much about Bryceland Charlie, but they were available in the early 1900s to be interviewed by this man, Pliny Goddard, who was one of the first 2 anthropology faculty members at UC Berkeley. The department was actually up and running about 1902, and Goddard was there from about 1902 into 1908. And he worked with Alfred L. Kroeber, who many of you have heard of, and actually has cut a kind of wide swath across California anthropology. You might recall that a couple of years ago, his name was removed from the anthropology department building at UC Berkeley. There was quite a period of activity there where students and tribal members and members of the public and researchers like myself urged the university to remove his name because of actually the racist and cultural biases that he had that actually had a negative effect on the Indian communities rather than a positive one. Goddard, on the other hand, as near as I can tell, had a very close relationship with individual Indians and was trusted by them, respected by them, and collected a tremendous amount of information. And every summer, when he wasn't teaching down at Berkeley, he would come up into this area, mostly into Humboldt County, and he would stop off at Laytonville and he would get his transportation there. He had a pack horse here on the left, and then he had a mule that he would use to ride. And he'd load up the pack horse and he'd saddle up the mule, and he would come up to Humboldt County and ride into the backcountry and look around for elderly Indians that he could interview. And he found quite a few of them and collected a tremendous amount of information. And it's thanks really to his work that we have some of the most direct and personal information about the Indians and their tribes in this area. And it's actually very different from what we know about the northern Humboldt Indians, where mostly we have to take secondhand information that ethnographers have written up. And actually right now I'm working on volume 5 in this series of books, which is Northern Humboldt Indians. And it's much harder for me to do that because I have to go to people like Kroeber, for example, who interviewed Indians, but we don't have his field notes, and we can't find out what the Indians themselves actually said. And that's what I'm always after, is to find out what the people themselves had to say before the academicians had a chance to analyze it and pick and choose what they wanted to tell us. So one of the people that both Goddard and another ethnographer, C. Hart Merriam, had to say about the Indians up here was this statement from Joe Duncan, and I unfortunately misspelled sleep. He didn't oversleep. It should only be 2 E's in the word. But Joe Duncan was a member of the Mattole tribe, and he lived down near the mouth of the Mattole River. And he was here when the whites came through that area, and they just cut through that area like a scythe, removing the Indians as quickly as they could. It was one of the areas most hardly hit very in a well, we can only say a genocidal sort of way. The whites would massacre villages, and later when they had troops available, not just vigilantes, but a military presence, they would also go back and attack Indians for years and years. So Joe was one of the few survivors that made it through that time period. And when he was interviewed later by Pliny Goddard out there on the Mattole, one of the things he said was that I never sleep at night. He very late in life, and we see him here probably about 1906 or so about 50 years after he'd encountered his first white people. He still could not go to sleep at night. He'd be scared. He would have anxiety attacks because so many bad things had happened to him. He was captured by a white man down on the Mattole, and he was put on a horse, and the fellow was going to take him back to his ranch on the North Fork of the Mattole River. And Joe managed to jump off the horse and run away, and the slaver was not able to catch him. But eventually he was captured, and he spent some time on the Hooper Reservation, and I believe also on the Smith River Reservation, but was finally able to come back to southern Humboldt and had a piece of property near the mouth of the Mattole River. And he had a son by the name of Ike Duncan, who was interviewed later than Joe. And it was very interesting. There was another ethnographer who interviewed the son, Ike, in the 1930s. And by that time, Joe was dead. So all they had were the written records of what Joe had said. And this ethnographer would read through those notes and let the son, Ike, hear what his father had to say. And then he'd ask, the ethnographer would ask Ike, well, what do you know about this? Or what can you tell me? And in some cases, Ike would remember something about a particular place or a particular incident and be able to say something. But time and again, he said, well, I just don't know anything about that. And it showed us how with a 20-year and one generation time lag, so much information had been lost unless you were able to directly contact some of this kind of first generation survivors of the Humboldt County Holocaust. You lost a lot of information. And so it was really with a series of interviews in the 1900s, 1910s, and maybe a little bit in the 1920s that you got the information that was so important and so direct from what had actually happened. Well, here I'm up on on the ridge between the South Fork eel, which is down here in the valley in the background, and the main eel, which is behind me. I'm at an area called Spruce Grove, where a tribal group that belonged to the Sinkyone tribe would come up in the summertime. And they lived on the east branch of the eel, South Fork eel, and also on part of the main eel down around where the Benbow Inn is today, be down in this area I'm pointing to with the arrow. But in the summertime, they would come up into the prairie areas, these grasslands and oak woodlands, and they would actually spend several months up there. In fact, the spot where I was standing, called Spruce Grove, was one of their big campsites. And one of the Indians from that tribal group said it was like a picnic area. We'd all come up, have a good time, but they would also gather the acorns, they would hunt game, they would collect seeds and berries, all of the things that were available to them in the summertime. And then in the fall, after they stopped having access to some of these foods, they go back down to their winter villages, which were down here on the east branch of the South Fork and on the main South Fork eel. You can see, though, what even today is a pretty unchanged area. There's been ranching. Of course, some of the wildflowers and wild species of plants have been removed. And of course, elk, things like that are no longer present, although I have seen a lot of deer down here. But it's turned into more of a cattle ranching, or for a while, a sheep ranching area, which changed the environment considerably. Now we're up north of there, near the town of Blocksburg, way back in the back country. You may have gone there sometime. You can take a road that takes you through Alder Point and Blocksburg and Bridgeville and Neyland. And here in the early 1900s, some of the local Indians, probably from the Nongadal tribe, although they might have been Alassic Indians from nearby, they've come back to re-inhabit an area where for a long time it was unsafe for them to live. And in the southern Humboldt area, they didn't create the houses that we've seen up here for Indians, like at Sumag or like out at Hoopa or at Requa, where they used the redwood slabs and had these kind of massive, very permanent structures. Down in the south, they built these smaller, conical, almost teepee-like shaped structures, and they would clad them with bark. But by the time this building was put up, they actually had cut lumber that they could gather. And this was their very small place that they could stay in the wintertime inside. And the shape is very similar to what they'd always used, but the outside material is different. And here we are up on the divide it's called Mail Ridge. It's the big ridge line that runs between the South Fork of the Eel and the main fork of the Eel. And we're up very near the top of that ridge. And when I took this photo, I was looking east. Way off in the distance is Trinity County. Way back here in the clouds are the Yolabali Mountains. This is Kettenpalm Peak, and the main Eel River is down below it. And so over here is Trinity County, and in the foreground is Humboldt County. Down at the bottom of this ridge line is Alder Point. Gives you some idea of what another tribe, what they would have for their terrain and they could live in. Just many, many oaks out there. And the acorns, along with salmon and other fishes, were their two main staple foods. And it was an area that was very abundant in both of those. And of course, they also had big game and berries and edible bulbs from various summer wildflowers. So most of the Indians in these areas did pretty well. The Lassics sometimes did have lean years. They said there was one year they faced starvation before the whites came. But for most of the time, you're much better off if you could be up here in Humboldt County than in other parts of the state, because there was such a wealth of various food available. Here's Jenny Young, a member of the Sinkyone tribe, and I call her a survivor. Well, of course, just about any of those early day Indians would have to be called survivors, because it was often the case where they were in danger of being killed at almost any time. Jenny's parents were killed at a massacre at Shelter Cove, probably in the late 1850s or early 1860s, but she managed to survive that. We don't know the exact circumstances, and she was living in the Bryceland area for quite a period of time, and this photo was taken when this man, Pliny Goddard, interviewed her in the early 1900s. So that's a real quick look at the Southern Humboldt Indians book. Now, we'll do Southwest Humboldt hinterlands. I divided the south part of the county into two sections for the next two books that I did. Southwest means that we're in the drainage of the Mattole River or the South Fork Eel. And so there's 24 chapters in this book that cover all the communities in those areas. And sometimes it wasn't even a major community. It might have only had a school or maybe not much more than that, but it was enough to qualify in my mind to get its own chapter. Mostly had to do with having enough information about the place. I should mention that in all of these books, these three books, all of the photos in them are colored. And they didn't start out that way, most of them, but I was able to colorize them. For example, the cover of the book here has a black and white photo of Bryceland, a town about 8 or 10 miles west of Garberville. And this photo was probably taken early 1900s, but by colorizing it, it seemed to very effectively separate the different buildings and make them stand out and give you more of a sense of what things were really like. Just like this photo on the back cover, which shows the original Redwood Highway in the Eel River Valley, probably in northern Mendocino County or southern Humboldt. And imagine having to drive that road in the early days, gravel and no guardrails. It was supposed to be 2 lanes wide, but just barely. And what if it was a foggy night or rainy, or you start having some rocks dropping down on the road? It would have been a much more exciting trip to take in those days than it is now, although we've certainly had to deal with situations along the Eel River that have also been difficult. So in this book, we start out over near the coast and go south all the way to the Mendocino County line, then go over to the east a little bit and go down the South Fork of the Eel. So starting off, I have a chapter on Bear River, which is the first major stream south of the Eel as you go along the coast. And there's a big ridge line between Ferndale and Bear River. And it's this ridge line here that's called Bear River Ridge. And back in the late 19th century, down here, either on the ridge or over to the left down in the valley or canyon of Bear River, there were over 80 different ranches or farms. They were all dairy farms, and they were all producing cheese, if you can believe that. It was the area in Humboldt County where all the cheese was made, and it had quite a reputation. All the logging camps would want to buy Bear River cheese, and they were bringing it up by wagon all the way to Humboldt Bay. And eventually the nexus of cheese making shifted from this area into the Eel River bottom, and then also up by Arcata and Arcata bottom there. But in the very early days, this was the place where you would go to get your cheese, or where you would make it. And there's actually a road that takes you down along this ridge into the Bear River Valley. And on the way, you go through various ranches. This one here is called Green Pond Ranch. It's one of about 18 or 20 ranches that the Russ family had out there, each with its own dairy operation. And if you got down in the valley itself, near the mouth of Bear River, or actually at the mouth, you would have seen this in 1915. I always like this story because this was a ship that ran aground there at the mouth of Bear River, and it happened to be named the SS Bear, the steamship Bear. So I think that maybe it was actually trying to migrate like a salmon up the Bear River, its namesake river, but it didn't make it very far. It got stuck right here at the mouth. And at first, the owners of the ship thought maybe it wasn't stuck on the sandbar too deeply. And if they threw out its cargo, maybe they could float it free. And in fact, you see over here at the left of the photo a couple of cables where I think they were hoping to pull the boat free. But first, they emptied a lot of its cargo. And what we see out here on the beach are two of the major things that they had stored on the ship. And one of them are these boxes here, which contain condensed milk, powdered milk. And of course, you had to add water to that, and then you got milk. And I don't know if you can see it down here, but each box says keep in a cool, dry place. And of course, these were all thrown into the ocean. Hardly, well, it was a cool place, but it was hardly very dry. And they washed up on shore. And I think in a couple of cases here, you might see where the milk is already kind of re-liquefied and is trying to come out of the boxes. These other things, these bizarre cylinders, are actually rolls of newsprint that were used by the printing presses for newspapers. And they weighed a lot, they weighed, I think each of these weighed about a ton. And so they threw out dozens of these into the ocean, and they thought, oh, they'll float back, on shore and we can salvage them. Well, they weren't paying attention, and they threw it out during an ebb tide. And as they watched, it looked like all the paper was going to float over to Japan. But it turned out that then the tide shifted and it washed it back on shore. And there's quite a story that I won't have time to tell you, but newsprint was salvaged and actually brought up to Eureka. And for a long time, it was a source of paper for a company that got started just using the salvage material from the wreck of the Bear. So then you go down the coast. You could take the Wildcat Road out of Ferndale and go over Bear River Ridge and go down to Cape Town and Bear River and go over another ridge and go along the ocean for a little ways. And then you come inland to one of the larger communities, very small as it is, but in the early days, one of the major communities in southern Humboldt, Petrolia. And here we see it probably around 1900. It got its name because they had discovered oil out there, and a collection of investors decided that they wanted to corner the oil market, and they bought up mineral rights or oil leases on a bunch of the property. And then they bought a section of flat area near the Mattole and actually subdivided it and named it Petrolia and started a little town there. And never got real big because they could never successfully extract enough oil to make things worthwhile. They had a number of wells there, and they spent a lot of money drilling for oil. But the most successful well that they ever had out there in its entire lifetime produced a total of 100 barrels of oil. So that's not a way that you're going to make any money. And even a century later, they were still sometimes hoping that they could strike a gusher out there and make a bunch of money on it. But it never happened. And I think now people are no longer very hopeful about Petrolia living up to its name. Well, big thing they did make money out in that area, in addition to ranching, was the harvesting of tan bark from the tan oak trees. Because up until about 1950, you needed a source of tannin when you wanted to tan leather. And the tan oak, as its name implies, had a lot of tannin in its bark. And so they'd send out crews like you see here in the springtime or just right before start of summer. And they would go out and they would cut down the mature tan bark trees, which can get pretty big. Some of them can get over 100 feet tall. And you can see this one's about 4 feet in diameter. And they would strip the bark off of it, as you see here, and leave the bark out during the summertime, where it would lose a bunch of its moisture, and then it would kind of curl up into a roll like a scroll of parchment, something in the shape similar to that. And then they come back in the late summer, early fall, gather this up and bring it into places like Bryceland and Shelter Cove, where it could be processed and then sent down to tanneries in the Bay Area and the Central Valley. We even had 2 or 3 tanneries up here. There was a tannery in Arcata, very near the Co-op Market, and there was a tannery out near Freshwater Corners. And I think there was a third one somewhere, but I can't remember where that was. And then all over sort of Central California, there were other leather tanneries. And then around 1950, they developed synthetic tanning agents, and they no longer needed to use the bark from the tan oak tree. But by then, almost all of the mature tan oaks in Humboldt County and surrounding areas have been cut down. And it's very hard today to find a mature tan oak tree, anything like the size of this. There's a spot or two in Humboldt Redwood State Park where the tan barkers never got to the mature trees, and you can still see some of the real tall ones, but mostly you see much shorter ones that are kind of understory plants in other areas. Here's the Shelter Cove Dance Band in the 1930s when they were doing a lot of commercial fishing there. And on the weekends, they would have dances down at Shelter Cove. And here's the 4-piece orchestra band that they had that played there. I'm always fascinated by a guy here on the right, Salvatore Pizzamente. And his day job was he was the salmon splitter. He weighed 247 pounds, and he was a powerful looking guy, as you can see, though he's playing this dainty mandolin. And during the day, he would split the salmons in 2, and then there was another guy that would gut the salmons, and they'd be able to process, thousands of these fish every day. But on the weekends, they'd have a dance, and he, along with the rest of this group, would play. And every once in a while, he'd take a break, and he had a dance partner who weighed over 200 pounds herself. And they were both apparently very graceful dancers, but together they weighed close to 500 pounds. And so all the other dancers would just kind of stand aside and let them do their dance thing, because if you bumped into them, you would probably be flattened. And here's what the little community looked like back in those days. Their wharf was very active, and there was a store, and off and on there was a hotel, but not too many buildings. There was a ranch. They actually had a working ranch out here. And after the Depression hit in the 1930s, they closed down the fishing operation, commercial fishing, and only after World War II was the community revived as a sports fishing area. Here we moved over to the Eel River. This is a South Fork of the Eel, 2 miles or so above the Benbow Inn. And this is Albert Smith and his wife, Sally Smith. Albert was one of the survivors of the Indian, well, they both were survivors of Indian genocide. Albert had been born 5 or 6 miles from here, and he came back once it was safe to live here again. And he and Sally actually lived here on the banks of the South Fork, where there had been a village belonging to his Tokubi Kia tribal group, which had been destroyed by the whites, but he was able to return very closely to his home. And a number of the Indians who survived the Holocaust of the mid-1800s were able to come back and find a place, at least nearby, where they had been born and grown up, and they could live there. And actually, it's Albert and Sally that you see on the cover photo in the Southern Humboldt Indians book. So here we're in downtown Garberville, and it's probably late 1920s, early 1930s. And this is the Redwood Highway, which used to come right through town. It got to Garberville as a road you could drive on, barely drive on, about 1917. And within a few years, it actually became much more drivable. That made a big difference to the area. Garberville had not been much of a town until then. In fact, Bryceland, where they had the tan bark industry operating, was a bigger town for a while. But once the highway came through, Garberville was the first main community you'd reach as you came up from the Bay Area. And you could stop at places like Knapp's Restaurant over here, where they have the bottle of milk and they command you to eat. And after a while, Mr. Knapp, who operated the restaurant, thought that the milk bottle wasn't an appealing enough sign. So instead, he cut out a piece of wood and painted it and fashioned a coffee cup up here. And then, this was really ingenious, he ran a pipe from his kitchen up to the sign, and it went through the center of the sign. And the pipe actually connected to the stove in the kitchen, and he was able to pipe steam up. And it looked like with the coffee cup, which you don't see here, but was here later on, it looked like you had a steaming cup of coffee. And I think that was a more effective attractant than the milk. Whoa, I'll go the other way here. If you go north from Garberville, in fact, from Garberville itself, you see this jagged-toothed mountain in the distance to the north, the Bear Buttes up here. And it's a remote, rugged area. It's one of the high locations in south central Humboldt County. In the book, I have quite an account about L.K. Wood, Louis Kaiser Wood, who was a pioneer settler, white settler in the Arcata area. In fact, there's L.K. Wood Boulevard that goes in front of Cal Poly Humboldt. And he had a story about being attacked by several bears up here and being seriously injured. Well, it turns out that his story probably wasn't true. And you'd have to look at the Bear Buttes chapter in the book to find out why. But I have a whole section in there with some newspaper articles about a bear attack occurring in a very different place than the Bear Buttes. And it may have been Wood that was attacked, but it doesn't look like he was attacked here. So I hope I've aroused your curiosity enough that you'll go and check that out. Ray Jerome Baker was a professional photographer in the early 1900s, and he hung out in southern Humboldt. In fact, he and his wife had a place north of Phillipsville, and this looks like a bicycle, but it's actually motorized. He called it a motorcycle, and he would take it in these remote areas where it was difficult to drive, and a car at least, and take wonderful pictures of the countryside or of people there. And a lot of times, like in this photo, he would have the bike visible to let you know that was kind of his signature, that this photo was by Baker, and he'd taken it as he had ridden his bike out there. And very near the house that he lived in near Phillipsville, there was another place, a rental that Indian family lived in, the Merrifields. And while Baker was there, he took this wonderful family portrait of all the people arranged by size in descending order at a time when they all look fairly happy, and looks like things might be going okay for them. Of course, they'd had their hard times already as survivors of what had happened in the 19th century. And it turned out that the family continued to suffer the effects of prejudice and the effect of not having much of an income. But this particular period in time, they were doing somewhat better. It seems to me to be a wonderfully posed image of those people. And here I think might be, I'm not sure if Baker was just on a bicycle here or not, but I think he took this photo up on the ridgetop above the South Fork Eel. I find this a really good example of what the homesteaders might have lived in around 1900, or a little before, a little after, because you could get 160 acres and try to turn it into a ranch, but that was hardly enough acreage to make a living on, and a lot of these places were lost for taxes, or the people just gave up and moved away. But here, a family by the name of Duckett are trying to make it there with their home-built cabin where they've made the shakes, and they even have a a chimney that's probably mud on the inside and then wood shingles on the outside. And each of the little Ducket girls here, they each have their baby goat with them. The Duckets were related to the Hunter family, and Judge Hunter, who lived, had a cabin, not more than a cabin, but a whole ranch out here, was actually quite wealthy. And his house in Eureka was a large mansion. You actually see it today, cat-a-corner from the municipal auditorium. Excuse me. So this is an area called Salmon Creek. And then if you go back down to the main or South Fork Eel from that and go downriver, 5 miles or so, you get to Myers Flat. And this is back when the Myers family were quite prominent there. The man here in front of the gas pump is Ulysses S. Grant Myers, who was a member of that family. And the store was owned by G.F. Cloney, who's the fellow standing in the doorway here. But this was right on the Redwood Highway. And it today would be on the Avenue of the Giants because they've converted the old highway into that. And the store isn't here anymore, but there still is a small store in Myers Flat that takes the place of this one. Grant Myers, I just have to tell you, he liked to have a few nips of whiskey in the afternoon and didn't always have the money to pay for it. So when he did have a little money, he bought a tin sheriff's badge, one of those six-pointed stars, and it said sheriff on it. And he got one of those and he pinned it on his shirt. And then he wore a jacket over that. And when he was really thirsty, especially on the weekends, he'd go and stand by the roadside behind one of these redwood trees, just a little ways outside of town. When he heard a car coming, he would time his entrance. And when the car got really close, he would jump out from behind the tree, and the car would have to screech to a halt to avoid hitting him. And then he'd walk up and he'd quickly pull his coat flap open and show the sheriff's badge. And then he'd close it up again, and he would tell the motorist, who was already a little shook up by all of this, that the fellow had been speeding and that he was going to have to go to court. And the court didn't meet until Monday. This was Saturday when he'd stopped this fella. And so you're going to have to stay over here. And conveniently enough, the Myers had the Myers Inn, and you could stay there if you needed to. But if you didn't want all of that expense, you could make bail. And it was a $5 fine. And if you just handed over me, the sheriff, Grant Myers, I would take that to the court on Monday and pay your bail, and you wouldn't have to stay over. And so all the motorists were just happy to get out of town after that. And they'd hand over their $5 and drive off. And as soon as they'd left, Grant would come over to Myers' store and he'd get his $5 bottle of whiskey and be all set for the weekend. And just down the South Fork from there is the town of Wyatt. And actually, most of that area had been covered with redwoods. But right there, when they put the highway through, and you had access to a roadway, and you also had access to the railroad, which had come through by then, some speculators bought small sections of land very near the roadway and cut down the redwoods there and split them up into things like redwood railroad ties and fence posts and grape stakes. And then all they needed was a small truck, and they could take it over to the railroad station at South Fork, about 5 miles away, and send it by train down to the Bay Area, like to the Napa Valley for the grape stakes, or actually they sold a lot of their railroad ties just to the railroad itself. And so after they'd been at work for a while, they had cut down all the redwoods around here. You can see a few young growth trees sprouting back up here in the 1930s. But eventually the Save the Redwoods League and the Humboldt Women's Save the Redwoods League were able to step in, and they managed to protect some of the trees, like this grove we see in the background. And if that hadn't happened, we probably would wind up having very few redwoods along the Avenue of the Giants where today there's a number of small dedicated groves as you go between Garberville area and Scotia. A big side canyon that went into the South Fork near its mouth was Bull Creek. In fact, that's a major part of Humboldt Redwood State Park. In the 1930s, this very small mill was operating there, and one of the owners was Irving Wrigley, that some of you folks might remember from 20 or 30 years ago. He had a big apple orchard out on Elk River, and I remember in the fall you would drive out there almost all the way to where Falk used to be, turn off and go to his place, and you'd buy a box or a bag full of apples there. But before Irving was in that business, he was actually cutting redwood timber in the Bull Creek area. And then down at the mouth of the South Fork, you had the little town of Dyerville. It's all gone now. There's just a picnic area there, and it's where they staged the Avenue of the Giants marathon. But before the highway went through, it was a pretty important stopping place because the only way you got across the South Fork was by a ferry, and it didn't always run, or you couldn't get across at certain times. So you had a store, that's the white building here. You had a hotel up here on the hillside. You had a livery stable, everything you needed for the travelers along here until the highway came through. When it came through, it actually took out several of these buildings, and gradually more of them were either washed away by floods or removed. And nowadays, all you have there are a couple of restrooms. Okay, now we'll finish up the program with Southeast Humboldt Hinterlands, the third book in this series. This one's over to the east, of course, in southern Humboldt, and it covers the Main Eel River and the Van Dusen River and the streams that feed into that. And for the cover of this one, this is the old town of Shively, which was it's very hard to get to today, and not much there anymore, except for some agriculture operations. But back around 1910, it's a very important place because the railroad was coming through here. It's across the Main Eel from Pepperwood. And you can see back here, this is Stockel's hotel where some of the workers stayed. And so for, maybe 8 or 10 years, it was kind of a boom town because workers who were building the railroad would stay there. And then later it became a resort area because the rail line went through. Well, if we go way, way up into the extreme southeastern corner of Humboldt County, we get to the little town of Harris up near the divide between the Main Eel and the South Fork. And back in the 1880s, 1890s, it was sheep country, and they harvested a lot of wool from the sheep. And here up near one of the hotels on the main road that went through there, you can see these huge bags of wool that are being put on a wagon and probably be taken to be shipped out of Humboldt County. And then the railroad came along, and it had a choice. They could either go up the South Fork Eel or the Main Eel, but it was decided that the Main Eel was the better route. And what that meant was that a few years later, when they wanted to put the highway in, it had to take the second best route and go up or down the South Fork Eel. But even here, going up the Main Eel, I like using this photo because it shows you how rugged it is. We're between Fort Seward and Alder Point on the rail line. And I think, in fact, this is, I believe, Steelhead Creek, maybe about halfway between those two towns. And there's not much room for anything going up this canyon. It's very steep-sided, very rocky. They managed to carve out a right-of-way for the rail line here on the south side of the river, but obviously there's not room for anything else there. You couldn't also try to put a highway in here. If you had just one of the two transportation corridors, that was all you're going to be able to do. And because the railroad got started first, they were able to use this canyon. And like I said, the South Fork Eel had to become the route for the highway. Well, when they put in the railroad, some speculators decided that they would turn Fort Seward into, as their promotional propaganda put it, the second largest city in Humboldt County. And started off, they built this beautiful craftsman style stone and shingle hotel, the Hotel Fort, right next to the rail line. In fact, this photo might have been taken almost from the tracks, and it was just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the railroad station. Well, it turned out that people enjoyed coming up on the train, and a few people stopped to stay here, but there wasn't much else to do at Fort Seward. You could, if you want to go out and fish a little in the Eel River, but there were no cultural activities. You were very far from any other community, and it made a little money for a little while, and eventually it stopped functioning as a hotel and was turned into a dormitory for loggers who were cutting Douglas fir out there in the 1950s and 60s. And during that period of time, it burned to the ground. And I went out there on a railroad excursion once, and what was left was a good part of the stone foundation. In fact, we had a catered lunch out there where we ate on the remnants of that foundation. Then you keep going down the rail line. You're now getting down close to Camp Grant and South Fork and Dyerville. You've come through a good part of the Eel River Canyon, and there was a small community established there. For a while, it was just called Young's because the Young family had a store right where the rail line kind of separated from the wagon road that went uphill here. And it was pretty busy for a few years, but once again, when the railroad continued building and got completed, it wasn't as active a spot. And so eventually the Young's store closed and they changed the name. Nowadays it's called McCann, McCann, because a fellow by the name of McCann had a small lumber mill there that was there later than the Young's store, outlasted Young's. And up on the hills east of McCann, we've left the Eel River Valley now, but we're on the old First County wagon road that went through the hills. And we're at the little town of Blocksburg, which for a while was a really busy place. And one reason why it was really busy, here we have all these bags of wool again. Now they aren't on wagons, they're just on pack mules, but they're going to be taken out of the area. In fact, Ben Blocksberger, the man that the town of Blocksburg was named for, was actually a wool merchant, and he would buy or bid on the different ranch production of wool, and then be in charge of seeing that they were shipped out of the area. And you see here, they've got a pretty good sized load. So this is a place where a lot of the ranchers made a lot of money for a number of years when the price of wool was quite high. And then the federal government dropped a tariff on wool. They used to prevent imported wool from like New Zealand and Australia from coming into the country because they charged a high tariff on the imports. And then in the 1890s, they dropped that tariff, and all of a sudden, Australia and New Zealand were sending in wool at a cheaper price than the locals wanted to sell for. And some of these ranchers who'd been spending their time in the saloons and gambling away their money went bankrupt because they hadn't paid off their mortgages, and they thought the good times would last forever, but they didn't. And gradually Blocksburg diminished as an important town. And today, if you go through Blocksburg, I think all you'll find is a abandoned school or closed school, a church, and a post office, and a cemetery. And so you don't see much wool, and you don't see any gambling, any stores, anything like that anymore. Then if you're up on the divide between the Main Eel and the South Fork, where there's another road that went along the ridge line, you could go through the Fruitland area. And that was a big agricultural area that never quite fulfilled its potential. There's quite a lengthy story in the book about how the enterprise failed in the early days, but there was enough of a community there that they built the Excelsior School that you see here, probably in the about 1940, and it's not doing too well in this picture, and it shut down after a while, but it's still there. At least it was last time I was up a few years ago, and you see it right by the side of the Dyerville Loop Road if you drive by. I think it's now used as a private residence. Then jumping back down to the Eel, and we're going down the Eel River now, we come to Larrabee Creek. It's a very large stream, almost a river in size, you can see here, starting up by Blocksburg in the hills, and it comes out and just off camera here, it joins the main Eel. And we're probably here about 1910, and Mercer Fraser Company, which is still in business here in Humboldt County, is building the railroad trestle across Larrabee Creek. And you can see that they're doing that with the help of one of these steam donkeys, the same kind of machine that they used out in the redwood logging operations to help move redwood logs into areas where they could haul them away. And this engine is powering a pile driver here, which is driving these piles into the riverbed to form part of the trestle. And that bridge is still there, but it hasn't been used in about 25 years since the railroad shut down. And very nearby on the other side of the Eel is what used to be called Holmes Flat, or sometimes just called Holmes. And the Holmes Eureka Lumber Company, which had a big mill in Eureka in back of the Bayshore Mall, logged this flat, all of this area here, in the early 1900s. And these were the little cabins they built for their logging crew to live in while they were there. I think it took them about 6 years before they logged off this entire flat. And then when they left, this was the residue, the cabins with no workers anymore. A lot of places where they logged, they just left things alone. And eventually, in the early days, even without planting new trees, there was a regrowth, and you started getting a second crop of redwood timber coming in. But the Holmes Eureka Company did something different. They actually subdivided this big flat that had been covered with huge redwoods and sold ranch parcels to people, or ranchettes. They were small, like 5 acres or so, but somebody could buy a parcel there and either have several big stumps on their property, or they could remove them, which was difficult and sometimes dangerous. But if you go down there today, you find a lot of houses and little small ranch-like properties there, all built on this area where they'd had a stand of very vigorous old-growth redwoods. Going down the Eel a little farther and crossing over to the west side, here we are in Pepperwood. You can go by Pepperwood today on the Avenue of the Giants, and there's a couple of little hiking trails in there, and there's usually a produce stand or two open in the summer. Well, this is right after the 1955 flood, and it wasn't as bad as the 64 flood, but look what it did here. Here's a couple of houses, maybe a gas station building. Here's a gas pump, and they're out blocking the road. They were just washed off their foundations out into the middle of the road. And so there had to be a lot of reconstruction and rehabilitation after 1955 to get things back in shape in Pepperwood. But most of the people who were there then stuck it out. They rebuilt or redid their properties. And then 9 years later, they had the 64 flood, and it washed out almost everything. And so almost all the residents left at that point in time, and you've never had a business community there since then. Now we jumped over to the Van Dusen River, and we're at Carlotta. So if you're going out on Highway 36, you go through Hydesville, then you drop downhill after 2 or 3 miles and cross a big stream called Yager Creek. and then you come to the business district. Some of you might remember that 10 or 15 years ago, Seamus T-Bone got started out here in this very building at the corner before they got big and famous and moved into Eureka. But nowadays, you really have no business district. You have 3 or 4 of the old business buildings out there. And this is about where the highway would come and then make a big turn and head south. But as you can see, back around 1920, it wasn't a very busy place. It was on the route, though, if you wanted to get out to Trinity County. In fact, it was a way that you could get over to the Central Valley by going on the route of Highway 36. And for a number of years, if you were in central Humboldt County, that's how you'd have to go east, because they did not complete Highway 299 until the late 1920s. And Highway 36 was actually an earlier route, the first route you could use to get over into the Central Valley. And out along there, Strong Station was a stopover. It was maybe 8 miles or so east of Carlotta. And here's the building in the background, but I just love the photo. I have no idea what these boys have been up to here. It might have been a kind of rowdy roadhouse type place. It had overnight accommodations, but it had a restaurant. And Andy Genzoli, the newspaper man, said that there were some bullet holes in the building where things had got rowdy once in a while. And I could see where if these boys had had a few too many beers or whiskeys, they might be willing to shoot up things themselves. That's all gone now. You can hike down to where it used to be, and you actually can see where the old highway was. There's some pavement, and there's even a white or yellow line along the center, but the buildings at Strong Station are long gone, and the highway now goes on the hillside up above it. If you kept going another 10 miles, 12 miles maybe, we got out to Bridgeville, and it lived up to its name because it had a bridge, many years, a covered bridge across the Van Dusen River. And here be the road over here on the right, coming up from Strong Station, Hydesville, and all those places. And then when you got here, you'd make a turn to the south and go across the Van Dusen on this bridge. And on the other side, you could either go straight ahead. That would take you to Blocksburg and Harris and all these places in southeastern Humboldt County, or you could take a left turn, and that's the way you went out to Trinity County. You go through Larrabee Valley and Dinsmore and places like that. Or if you didn't want to do either of those things, you could make a left turn here and go up this road, and that would take you up to Iaqua and Neeland and back down to Freshwater. And all of that was part of the first wagon road that they had going out of Humboldt County. Well, on your way up to Iaqua, if you made that left turn and was leaving Bridgeville, you go near the Showers Pass area. And this is a pretty exciting story, at least I thought it was, so I wrote it up for the book. Up in the 1930s, in this very remote area above the Mad River, there were some ranchers, and there was a store and a school, not too much else, and a lot of snow. And so in the middle of the winter, this man here, Ralph High Rock Gordon, wanted to mail some letters at the post office, and he was having to come in from his ranch, which was over to the north near the Mad River. And the mail carrier had already come to the Showers Pass post office, and they were waiting around, and they heard a gunshot, and they're coming from the north. And the folks there said, well, that's probably High Rock letting you know that he's on his way because he, wants to drop off some mail. And so they waited around for a while for High Rock to show up, and he didn't. So a couple of the boys went out to see what was going on, and they found High Rock, but he was there kind of half buried in the snow, and there was a big pool of blood staining the snow nearby. And he actually had tried to get his gun out, but he fumbled it, and he shot himself in the leg. And it was a very serious wound, and he was just there kind of slowly bleeding away. So they managed to bring him into the store, and there's 5 feet of snow or so on the ground everywhere around there, and it's by trail, it's a dozen to 15 miles just to get to Bridgeville. Well, they sent out a messenger who got down to Bridgeville where there's a phone, and they phoned and they said, we need a doctor out here. And they hunted around and no one wanted to do it. And finally, Sam Beret, that the Beret Center is named for, volunteered. He was just new as a doctor. And he said, well, I'll go out and do it. Only problem was he didn't know how to ride horses. And from Bridgeville on, like I say, about 15 miles, you had to go through the snow on horseback. So he got his first lesson in the saddle riding out there. And he got there, and High Rock was there. He's still alive, but he was feverish and his wound had been infected. And Beret said, well, we got to get him into the hospital. I can't do enough for him here. And so this is what they were facing. You see the terrain there. So they made a kind of sled using a piece of sheet metal for the runner on the bottom, and then they piled some wood on that, and they had some hay tucked into a sheet to kind of make a bed, and they put him on top of it. And at first they tried moving him by horse, and they only made about a mile or two, and the horses, well, first they tried actually pulling him by hand, and those guys gave out. Then the horses could only go a couple of miles at a time. And then they had the rest for a long time. They had to change horses. But after, I think, 2 nights and 3 days, they got him into Bridgeville. They got him to the hospital. He survived. He came back, and everything was okay. But it was a pretty dramatic trip during the dead part of winter, and almost a deathly winter for Old High Rock. Then out in that same area, on the Bridgeville-Neeland Road, you get to an area called the 1,000-acre field. And as near as I could tell, it wasn't quite 1,000 acres, but this is part of it. And it's mixed in. It's a lot of grassland, a lot of prairie. And then you have a lot of oaks out there also. And the Niles family, Dewey Niles, had a ranch down near Lolita. And he married Doris Kildale, became Doris Kildale Niles, and became a very well-known educator up in this area. In fact, she actually got her pilot's license and could fly into remote locations to give presentations and do teaching. But they had this second ranch out here just off the Bridgeville-Neeland Road. And this is one of the Merle Schuster photos that are available online at the Humboldt, or the Cal Poly Humboldt website. And I colorized it to, make it green and tan instead of just black and white. But you get some idea of what a lot of the terrain is out there. And actually, part of that area is still in the Niles family. Peggy Niles, the daughter of Doris and Dewey, married John Rice, who I believe just died last year, and had a very large ranch out in the Showers Pass area near where High Rock Gordon had to make his trip. So that gives us some idea of what the area is like in the Van Dusen drainage, and what you would read about in the Southeast Humboldt Hinterlands book. And that brings us to the end of the program. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them. I'll mention, if you want to look at any of these books for free, or you can download them for free, if you go to the Cal Poly Humboldt Library website, and then on that site, they'll direct you to what's called the press at Cal Poly Humboldt. And that's an actual press that prints books. They're the ones that have done all 3 of these books. But in addition to printing regular copies, they have electronic versions that you can access through that website. And if you go to the site for me that has my name on it, it has the 4 books of mine that they've published, and you can just click a button and you can get an ebook, an electronic version of the book in full color, and have it on your own computer, or you can look at it online. And so you can either do that, or if you want the books, you can certainly buy them. You can get them at the Historical Society, and then also at the local bookstores. So I think that finishes this up. Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions if we have any listening.
Yeah, if you guys could put your questions into the chat window, I'll go ahead and read them out. There is one that asks, how many deceased Native Americans during the genocide?
What was the first part of that?
How many deceased Native Americans during the genocide?
How many? We can't tell for sure. We just don't know how many or what the population was out here, and they've never been able to, figure out what that number would have been before so many Indians were killed in the 50s and 60s. But I would say, just as kind of a general ballpark figure, that many of the tribes up here probably had somewhere between 2 to 4 or 5,000 Indians in each group. And if we use that figure down in southern Humboldt, I wouldn't be surprised if we had 8 to 12,000 Indians before they were attacked by the whites. And within 50 years, those population numbers had dropped probably by about 90%. The combination of outright killing of the Indians and then disease, illness that struck them, new diseases that hit them like smallpox, and then also the fact that they no longer had access to their usual food sources. They were landless. They'd been driven off their land, and they were just having to exist as best they could. So many of them lived in very difficult circumstances. And so it wasn't just the outright killing during the genocide period, but it was them being in these dire straits for many years afterwards. And so by 1900, it looks like with a lot of these populations, you might have only had 10 to 20% of the Indians still left alive.
Great. And then another question, what is the name of the professional photographer with the motorbike?
Yeah, that's Ray, R-A-Y, Jerome, Jerome, Baker, B-A-K-E-R. And once again, if you go to the Cal Poly Humboldt Library website, you can go to their photography collection, and you can actually sort by name, and you can get all of the Baker photographs. And they have a lot of Baker photographs there. You can look at them online, and you can actually download copies of those for free if you like them. That's how I acquired a lot of the ones that I used and then colorized. And the same way with this photo right here, there's over 2,000 of these aerial photos of Humboldt County from the 1940s through the 1960s that Merle Schuster did, S-C-H-U-S-T-E-R. And once again, you could sort by name for him. And then say you wanted to find photos of the Neeland area or McKinleyville or just about any particular place. You could put in a location and the photographer's name, and then you'll get this drop down list of the photos. And I have little thumbnails that will show you what the picture looks like. You can click on the thumbnail and look at it on screen and go one more step, and they will send you a file, electronic file that has a copy of the photo.
Great. And speaking of this photo, we had a question. They were wondering if this could be a landing strip on Niles Ranch.
Oh, well, could be. I've seen a few other aerials of the area, nothing I could identify as a landing strip, so I'm not sure about that. It's a big area and this is fairly flat, and I think it would have been possible. The two areas out there I know of course, is the airport up at Neeland, which would be about 15 miles to the north, and then of course you have one out at Dinsmore. But it's possible that there were landings out here. I've never read anything about it, though.
Okay, another question. Has anyone considered requesting that the name of Larrabee Creek be changed, since it's named for someone who we may not want to honor with that place name?
Well, this comes up every once in a while, and when it does, I usually come up with a list of offensive names, and his name is at the top of the list. I think it's possible it could be changed. To do that, my understanding is you have to petition what's called the Board of Geographic Names, which is a federal board that makes decisions on these sorts of things. And they're notoriously conservative about changing names. And of course, it creates problems when they're doing maps and things like that would have to be altered. But there are ways to petition to have this happen. And I think realistically, the best chance you have of having that happen is if the request comes from one or more of the Indian tribes, because they actually have more clout in this area than I think just a general member of the public does. And of course, they were the people that suffered the most well, they were the people that suffered, period, at Larrabee's hands. So there is a way to do that. And, approaching, in this case, the Bear River Rancheria would be the official Indian tribe that would have ancestral connections to this area out here where Larrabee Valley is. So that would be one approach to take. Sometimes they've been able to change names when it's on state property. You might remember that for the last couple of years, they changed the name of Patrick's Point to Sumeg, using the Indian name out there. And Patrick had been a man who had murdered a couple of Indian boys and actually fled the area because they were going to take him to court about it. So he was another unsavory character like Larrabee. And they also down in Humboldt Redwood State Park, they changed the offensive name of Squaw Creek there. So they were able to do that because it was park property and they could change the name because they were the controlling group for that land. But if it's just out on private property, something like that, I think it always has to go to the Board of Geographic Name. And in fact, if it's just a landmark, I think even something like Squaw Creek to become official on a map would, like a geographic map, would have to be approved by the federal agency.
Okay. There was somebody who they missed the name of the wealthy Eureka family that was related to the Duckets.
The Hunters, Judge Hunter, what is his first name? I'm not remembering his first name right now, but might have been Thomas Hunter. But anyway, his house is still standing. It's a big gray Victorian. If you go to the Muni Auditorium and you're coming up out of Old Town, and you you pass the Muni, you're on F Street going south, and you come to the next intersection, the Hunter house will be cat-a-corner from the Muni's property on the southeast corner of F Street, and I don't know what that is, about 9th. And it's been converted into a series of apartments, but it was a formidable Victorian for a number of years. It has a square tower, 3-story tower on one corner of it. But I just can't remember his first name now. I'm sorry. But anyway, I think it might be Thomas Hunter, and that's the property you'd want to look at if you were interested.
Okay, it looks like that was all of our questions. So I want to go ahead and thank all of you for joining us. Thanks, Jerry, for the presentation. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carl Johnson and the Cutting Edge Hair Design. And don't forget to join us next month. I believe it will be live streamed from the Clarke Museum, so you'll have the chance to see it live or just watch on YouTube, and we will send that information out next month. On that note, I'll say thank you to everybody and wish you all a good weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, folks.